Hello, I'm Keith Hocton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. At the turn of the 20th century, Birmingham stood as one of the great industrial powerhouses of the world, a city of brass, smoke, and relentless invention, celebrated for its enterprise and civic pride, and convinced, perhaps dangerously so, of its own modernity and success. It was a place that made things, that exported its skill and ingenuity across the globe, and it carried with it a deep belief that it had somehow mastered the age in which it lived. Yet beneath that confidence lay another Birmingham entirely, one rarely spoken of in the same breath, where whole districts were crowded into badly built back-to-back houses, where poverty wasn't incidental but structural, and where lives were shaped by irregular work, illness, and a quiet, persistent understanding that no one of any consequence was coming to help you. This was not a temporary condition or an unfortunate byproduct of progress. It was the reality for nearly half the population of the United Kingdom, and it formed the environment in which a different kind of life took place. In those streets, the street itself became the only possession that a man could claim, and it was defended not through law or custom, but through violence, through reputation, and through the simple, brutal fact of being harder than the man next door. Territory wasn't abstract. It was immediate, physical, and constantly contested, and the ability to hold it depended not on wealth or status, but on a willingness to use force when required. The figures who emerged from that world have since been dressed up. They've been romanticized and mythologized, turned into symbols of style and swagger. But the reality, I think, was far more unsettling because these were not heroic gangsters or master criminals, but young men shaped by hardship and capable of extraordinary cruelty, and feared most by the very communities from which they came. They weren't distant villains operating outside society. They were embedded within it, part of the same streets, the same families, the same fragile social fabric. And it was often their own neighborhoods who suffered most at their hands. They were known by a name that still carries a certain chill in those areas, the Peaky Blinders. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is their story. It begins not with a single gang or a single family, but with the rise of these so-called slogging gangs, loose groups of street fighters, youths, and very young men who roamed the working class districts of Birmingham in the 1860s, drawn together, I have to say, not by any clear structure whatsoever, but by opportunity, by identity, and by a shared acceptance of violence as a part of everyday life. It ends decades later in a very different world, one of race courses, organized control, and money, where some of those same instincts would evolve into something far more coordinated and far, far more dangerous. Between those 2 points lies an incredible story that is far less glamorous than fiction would suggest, and far more revealing of the society that produced it. It's a story not simply about crime, but about poverty, policing, political tension, and social change in industrial Britain, and about what happens when large numbers of young men grow up in conditions where stability is rare and authority is both mistrusted and inconsistently applied. Robin Bex's book, Peaky Blinders, The Real Gangs and Gangsters, opens up in that world in remarkable detail, and it provides the foundation of what we're going to explore here today, which is stripping away the myth in order to understand who the Peaky Blinders really were, where they came from, and how far the popular image has drifted from the historical reality. Don't get me wrong, I love the TV show. I've watched it 3 or 4 times. I've watched the latest movie, and I love it all. But I also knew at the back of my mind that maybe it kind of didn't happen that way. And when I started going down that rabbit hole of investigating and then Robin Bex's, book, it was a story I think that has to be told and it has to be understood from a proper perspective. So let me take you into Birmingham at the height of the industrial age, because it's very easy to misunderstand what Birmingham was really like at that particular time. By the late 19th century, Birmingham had become something extraordinary, a place of constant motion, of noise, of heat, of invention. It called itself the City of 1,000 Trades, and that was no exaggeration. This was a city that could turn its hand to almost anything. Small metal goods, buttons, guns, jewelry, brassware of every conceivable kind, from bedsteads to fittings that found their way into homes across Britain and overseas. It was a city built not on a single industry, but on thousands of small interconnected skills, each feeding the other, each evolving as technology shifted. And that ability to adapt is what kept Birmingham alive as the century clicked over. The older trades didn't simply disappear, they transformed. A workshop that once produced a gun or a gun barrel could turn to tube making, and from there move into bicycles, and from bicycles into motorbikes. Firms such as the Birmingham Small Arms Company, BSA, are a perfect example of this shift, moving from weapons into bicycles and then into motorbikes, following the machinery, following the opportunity, if truth be told, and following the current trends in the market. And what that meant was that for a certain class of worker, skilled and semi-skilled, there was stability, even a degree of prosperity, and with that came slightly better housing. You begin to see the spread of what were known as tunnel-back homes, long terraces built tightly side by side to maximize space, but with a depth that pushed the house back into the plot. A front room, a room behind, bedrooms above, and then a narrow yard beyond. In places like Sparkhill and Bournebrook, these terraces gave the impression of order, even modest progress, which was a step up from what had come before. But that's only half the picture, and it's the more comfortable half. Because what's too often overlooked is that nearly half the population of Birmingham, around 200,000 people, lived in something altogether different, a ring of poverty that wrapped itself around the city centre. Here, the houses were not just small, they were badly built, they were thrown up very quickly, they were already decaying, and often dangerously insanitary. Back-to-back housing where homes shared walls on multiple sides, where light barely entered the home itself and air struggled to circulate. These were places of damp, of overcrowding, of disease. And it was in these districts, already marked by hardship and ill health and very early death, poor pay and irregular work, that the influence of the Peaky Blinders was felt most sharply. And look, Birmingham wasn't unique to this. You'll see the same pattern in the East End of London, in parts of Manchester, in the docks of Liverpool. A cycle of labour that was never guaranteed. When trade was good, there was work for unskilled men, on building sites, in factories, at the docks. But when trade slowed or stopped, there was nothing to fall back on. No safety net, no buffer, just the immediate question of what came next. For many, that meant turning to whatever could be done on the streets. Street trading was one option, pushing a barrow, selling small goods, scraps of food, anything that might bring in a few coins. But even that was precarious. When the weather turned and when the rain came down, the streets would empty, and with them, any chance of earning anything at all. Survival then became uncertain, not in some distant, abstract sense, but literally day by day. And within these colder central districts of Birmingham, what you find is a concentration of that uncertainty. Unskilled men moving in and out of work, families living close to the edge, and women working wherever they could. Factory work for women did exist, And in relative terms, it was better paid than charring, than cleaning, than taking in washing or sewing buttons onto cards for sale in small shops. It was still low paid, still demanding, and still part of a very much wider struggle to keep a household afloat. This was the environment in which people lived, and it's impossible to understand the violence that followed without first understanding that world, because it's here, in these streets, in these cramped and very unforgiving conditions, that the foundations of those gangs were laid. What you see then inside the factories and the small workshops of Birmingham is a workforce that is far more fragile than the outward success that the city would suggest. Single women and young married women with no children, or perhaps one or two, are drawn into the factory work because in relative terms, it offers something steadier, something slightly better paid than the alternatives. It's still not equal to men's wages, far from it, but it's preferable to charring, to cleaning, to taking in washing, or to slow, repetitive labor of sewing buttons onto cards by hand. That work by itself tells you something about the world they lived in. There were no machines for such tasks. Not yet. Everything was done manually. Each button fixed into place, each card prepared for sale in small shops where they would be bought one at a time. It's a detail that seems almost trivial until you realize how many hours of labor sit behind that particular button packet. How many hands were involved in producing the smallest, most ordinary objects. Life expectancy reflects the same reality. Around 45 years for men, just under 50 for women. And it's a figure that carries within it infant mortality, disease, poor nutrition, and the simple cumulative wear of hard lives lived in different conditions. Because this is a city where poverty is not occasional, it's constant. Work is irregular, housing is cramped and often dangerously insanitary, as I mentioned. And the basic infrastructure of daily life is shared, stretched, and inadequate. In many courts, in many rows of housing, one toilet serves up to 20 houses. It's built over a cesspit. It's positioned at the far end of a narrow yard or a small shared courtyard that backs onto a lane. That lane actually exists for a single purpose, to allow access for the night soil man who arrives with a cart in the middle of the night, a bucket, and the unenviable task of emptying those cesspits several times a week. It's filthy work, it's dangerous work, but it's absolutely essential to the functioning of the city. He would have been paid maybe 3 to 5 shillings a night, the wage of a working man. But the nature of the work places him outside the social fabric. He's unseen to avoid unnecessary questions, and he's quietly disregarded. A figure who moves through the margins of the city, keeping it alive in ways few would willingly acknowledge. And of course, alongside this, you have children entering that same world far too early. In the 1880s, it's not uncommon for youngsters of 6, 7, and 8 years old to be working in workshops and factories, contributing what they can to the household. Compulsory schooling actually begins to change towards the end of this decade. But even then, the reality is more complicated. Children attend when they can, but many simply don't because hunger intervenes. A child who has not eaten doesn't sit in a classroom for long. Instead, they find ways to earn money by selling newspapers for half a penny and taking that half penny into an eating house where, for just half a penny, they can buy a slice of bread dipped into pig fat from a spit that's been turning slowly over heat. And for some, that's the only meal that they will eat that day. So these are hard lives, and they're not unique to Birmingham. The same patterns repeat themselves in Sheffield, in Leeds, in Glasgow, in Dublin, across the industrialized cities of Britain. But here in Birmingham, with its dense network of trades and its vast working population, the pressures are particularly acute. And it's within this environment where hardship is ordinary and stability is rare, that a certain kind of toughness begins to take hold. And with it, the conditions from which the gangs will emerge. And then you begin to see something else emerging, something more volatile, more dangerous, and far less easy to explain away as simple poverty. Because Birmingham in the 1860s isn't just poor, it's a restless city. And at times, it was a completely lawless city. There were riots, not one or two isolated incidents either, but repeated outbreaks of violence. And it raises an important question, whether this was simply the result of deprivation or whether something deeper, something more political was beginning to take shape. What you have, quite starkly, is a mass of poor people living under pressure and an elite that is largely untouched by it. Birmingham is at the very same time being praised as one of the best governed cities in the world, a model, if you like, of civic success, of modern urban planning, of enlightened leadership, and yet that praise sits uneasily alongside the lived reality of a large part of its population. Take the decision by Joseph Chamberlain to build Corporation Street, a very famous street. It's presented as progress, a grand Parisian-style boulevard, wide, impressive, a statement of confidence and civic Birmingham achievement. But progress of that kind comes at a cost. And in this case, the cost is measured in people. Around 5,000 residents are displaced, their homes cleared to make way for this vision of modernity, and they're pushed outward into districts that are already overcrowded and already struggling to cope. That displacement has consequences. Demand for housing increases sharply, and the slum landlords respond in the only way that benefits them. Rents rise. As rents rise, families take in lodges to survive, and the already cramped spaces become even more crowded. You know, a small two-bedroom house may now hold up to 8 to 10 people, sleeping in shifts, sharing beds, living in conditions where privacy completely disappears and disease spreads easily. Tuberculosis, along with, other communicable diseases and illnesses, finds very fertile ground in these such environments. And once it takes hold, it moves very quickly. So when Birmingham acquires a reputation as a city of rioters, it's worth being precise about what that really means. It's not simply that people are rioting, it's that the city itself has become deeply impatient and deeply violent. The conditions are there for confrontation, and confrontation becomes part of daily life. And the riots are just one expression of that. But they're not the whole story, because running alongside this is the emergence of the backstreet gangs, and the rise is very closely tied to the political and social tensions of that time. By 1868, you begin to see clear references to named gangs. There's the Bar Street Gang, the Park Street Gang, groups that will persist for years, sometimes even decades. They don't appear out of nowhere. They are the product of several pressures coming together at once. And of course, one of those pressures is actually coming from the middle classes, who still live in some numbers in and around the older parts of Birmingham. They are increasingly uncomfortable with what they see around them, and particularly on Sundays. For the working classes, Sunday is often the only day of rest, and the only day when young men can gather, talk, play rough games, and engage in small-scale gambling like pitch and toss. It's noisy, it's physical, and to the middle class sensibilities, it's deeply improper. There's also a moral dimension to this discomfort. Sunday, in their view, should be a day of quiet, of restraint, of religious observance. And what they see instead are groups of young men drinking, swearing, and as they would put it, abusing the quiet sanctity of the day. So pressure is brought to bear on the police to intervene, to break up these gatherings, to suppress what is seen as disorder. But when you attempt to impose order in that way on men who have very little else, the reaction is rarely compliance. It's always going to be resisted. And that resistance increasingly takes a violent form. What follows from that pressure is not order, but escalation. Young men, teenage lads, men in their late teens and early 20s begin to gather more deliberately, more defensively, and then more aggressively. And what had once been loose groups on waste ground hardens into something else, something with identity, with territory, and increasingly with a willingness to meet force with force. These are the early formations of what will become the street gangs. And they're not yet organized in any formal sense, but they are already learning how to act together, how to defend themselves, and how to strike back. And into this already volatile atmosphere comes something that pushes it further still. At this stage, there's a man by the name of William Murphy. He's a Protestant preacher who had once been a Catholic, who now builds his entire platform on denouncing the faith that he's left behind. So he establishes his tabernacle deliberately close to an Irish Catholic district. And what follows isn't preaching in any ordinary sense, but provocation. He shouts abuse at the Pope. He shouts abuse at passing priests, at nuns, at the people themselves. And he does so with a kind of theatrical hostility that's designed specifically to inflame. Those who come too close are spat at, they're insulted, and they're baited. And of course, it doesn't take long for this to ignite. On the very first day, violence breaks out. Irish Catholics attack his tabernacle. Murphy, anticipating trouble, has actually hired Protestant gangs to protect him. But the numbers overwhelm them, and he only just escapes with his life. The following day, the retaliation comes, as expected, and it comes hard, as a large English crowd turns on the Irish districts. What begins as agitation becomes open street conflict. And of course, it doesn't settle quickly. At the same time that this is going on, the police are now continuing their campaign against the pitch and toss gatherings. They're against any form of informal assembly. Raids take place whenever such groups form, and each intervention produces another flashpoint, another confrontation. And crucially, the young men involved are no longer intimidated by the police. Some of them are already being paid, not just by local figures, but by wealthier interests, by merchants and by political operators who find the chaos useful. Disorder provides cover for smuggling, for prostitution, for gambling, and also I think maintaining that disorder becomes in itself a kind of business. By the late 1860s, you have multiple forces colliding on the same streets. Irish Catholic groups, including those influenced by Fenian ideas, local Birmingham gangs, and of course the police, all engaged in what are effectively rolling battles that can erupt at any particular moment. Violence is no longer occasional, it actually becomes embedded. And then politics enters the equation in a very much more direct way. With the extension of the vote in the late 1860s, sections of the working class now matter electorally. Their support can influence outcomes, and both liberals and conservatives understand this very quickly. But rather than simply persuading voters, they also begin to use the tools already available to them on the streets. Gangs are hired to disrupt meetings, to intimidate opponents, to break up gatherings, effectively to control space in a way that mirrors what they are already doing at a local level. By 1884, this reaches a level that's very difficult to ignore. Birmingham is dominated by Prime Minister Chamberlain and the Liberals. But Lord Randolph Churchill arrives to challenge that dominance. He holds a large meeting at what was then known as the Lower Grounds, which later actually became Villa Park, and he hires gangs to protect the event. The Liberals respond in kind, marching through the streets with drums and music, moving into pubs, targeting rival gang leaders. And what follows isn't simply disruption, but a full-scale riot. The violence is so severe that Churchill raises it in Parliament, naming specific gangs for the first time. The Leach Street Gang, the Harding Street Gang, the Bar Street Gang, describing them as among the worst in the country. It's actually recorded in Hansard. It becomes a matter of national attention. But even here, the reality is murkier than the accusation. Chamberlain's supporters moved quickly to undermine the claim, paying gang leaders to deny involvement, to state that they weren't present, that they hadn't been hired, and the issue was eventually dismissed. Churchill is left embarrassed, but beneath that embarrassment, I think lies a simpler truth, that these gangs are being used and that their loyalty can be bought. And that's the point at which several threads then come together. You have the moral pressure and policing of working class leisure, which has already pushed young men towards collective resistance. You have sectarian agitation in the form of Murphy, which has normalized riots and confrontation. And you have political interests actively employing gangs as instruments, reinforcing their organization and their sense of purpose. So within a relatively small area of Birmingham, gangs such as the Park Street Gang, the Milk Street Gang, the Bar Street Gang, the Barford Street Gang, they're all operating within a few hundred yards of one another. And what they decide to do is define themselves not just against authority, but against each other, all vying for the same business. But they're also fighting for territory, for reputation, and ultimately for control. And they continue to do so for decades, carrying that culture of violence forward into the early 20th century. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So then I wondered, well, where does the name come from? Where does Peaky Blinders come from? How did it endure? And how did it carry all of this weight with it? So it doesn't actually begin with the Peaky Blinders, not at first. As I said, in the earlier years, these men are described more plainly, more bluntly as street ruffians, a term that kind of says very little beyond the obvious, that they're rough, that they're violent, that they exist on the edge of order. But by the early 1870s, a more specific word appears, sloggers, drawn from the language of fighting, from the idea of delivering a heavy, punishing blow. A slogger belongs to a slogging gang, and that tells you something important, that violence is not incidental. It's actually the defining characteristic. Then around 1890, a new term begins to circulate, one that will actually outlast all the others, Peaky Blinders. And what matters here is that it doesn't refer to a single gang, nor a single family, nor a tightly controlled organization as we see in the TV series, but to a broader type, a whole class of backstreet youth in Birmingham who share a look, a reputation, and a way of moving through the city. They're actually part of a wider phenomenon. Birmingham is not unique in producing them. In Manchester and Salford, they're known as the Scottlers. In Liverpool, as the Corner Boys. In London, as Ruffians. Until, after a particularly violent bank holiday in 1898, a new word enters the language: hooligan. So different names, different cities, but the same underlying pattern. Young men forming loose territorial groups defined by violence, by identity, and by the streets that they claim as their own. In Birmingham, the terms overlap. Peaky Blinders, sluggers. They're used almost interchangeably at times. And what begins to distinguish them, I think, more clearly is not just their behavior, but actually their appearance. At first, that appearance is simple. It's a colorful silk scarf known as a daff, worn around the neck, sometimes knotted tightly as a choker. It's a small detail, but it serves as a marker, a way of recognizing one another on the street. And different gangs have different colors. In Manchester, the equivalent is a woolen muffler, a different material, the same function, identity made visible in a crowded and contested environment. But by the 1890s, something more deliberate emerges, a style that is both practical and performative. Bell-bottom trousers, wide at the base, mostly tied at the knee, the silk scarves still present, and then they add a hat called the billycock, which is a working man's bowler, worn low, often pulled over one eye. Their hair has been cropped short, but not entirely, leaving enough to create a distinctive quiff silhouette. And it's a look that signals to one and all that you belong, and it also marks territory without a word being spoken. And it's here that that name, Peaky Blinder, actually starts to make sense. The peak of the billycock, later the flat cap, is drawn down over one eye, blinding it, or appearing to, giving the rise to the term Peaky Blinder. It's not a weapon, not at first, but a style, a way of presenting oneself, of projecting an image that is at once controlled and threatening. You know, there's a popular conception that they show in the TV show that the Peaky Blinders actually stitched razor blades into their caps. But in almost every sense, that's a myth. It makes for very good drama, I have to say, but it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. You know, razor blades at that time, disposable razor blades, were very expensive. You know, a set of quality Sheffield steel blades might cost 37 shillings, while a poor man in Birmingham might earn a little more than 17 shillings in a week. So it's not a practical weapon for men living at that level. There are accounts later of blades being sewn into the lapels of their jackets, you know, used defensively in close fighting. But even that appears much later and not until the 1920s. The theory being that if you get into a fight and someone grabs you by the lapel, their hands are going to be cut to ribbons because of the razors that you've sewn into it. So what we're really looking at is not a single invention, but a gradual shaping of identity through language, absolutely through clothing, and then through their reputation. You know, the Peaky Blinder becomes shorthand, if you like, for a type of young man, a backstreet fighter, recognizable, feared, and embedded in the life of Birmingham. But if you step back from Birmingham just for a moment, I think the pattern becomes clearer still. I spent some time growing up in Glasgow, and the stories that were passed down there, particularly about the razor gangs of the 1930s, you know, they carry a familiar tone. My mother would talk about them, you know, stories she had heard from her own mother. And among them, the most infamous was the Billy Boys. And the Billy Boys are actually mentioned in the Peaky Blinders TV series. But they too have been absorbed into folklore, turning into something almost stylized over time, very much like the Peaky Blinders. But when you strip that away, I think what remains is something far harsher: sectarian violence, organized brutality. You know, young men, many of them barely out of boyhood, shaped by poverty and identity into instruments of fear, moving through their own streets as both products of the world that made them and agents of the violence that has sustained it. And that, more than anything else, is the reality behind the name. These were brutal men, and I think it's important not to soften that reality, because so much of what has been written and filmed since has done precisely that. For instance, something almost jarring in the way they treated the Salvation Army. They didn't treat them as rivals, of course, nor threats in any meaningful sense, but visible, organized, and morally upright. And for that reason alone, they became targets of the gangs. The Salvation Army women in particular were singled out, harassed, attacked, and driven off the streets. Not because I think they posed a danger, but because they represented order and discipline and a kind of public virtue that these gangs instinctively pushed against. And I think that instinct runs through absolutely everything that they did. Like the Scottlers of Manchester, you know, the Corner Boys of Liverpool, the hooligans of London, these Birmingham gangs preyed most heavily on the very people who lived alongside them. That, more than anything else, is their defining trait. Not daring robberies or grand criminal schemes, but the steady intimidation of the poor, the bullying of those who were already struggling, the extraction of what little they had. And I think it's a very uncomfortable truth because it strips away any lingering romance. These weren't rebels striking upwards, they were predators operating within their own communities. They baited the police constantly, testing boundaries, provoking confrontation. And the consequences were actually very severe. 3 policemen were killed and many more were injured in one particular riot. Policemen were permanently injured. They were forced to leave the police force after encounters that left them completely broken. The gangs also fought each other with equal ferocity. And there were killings and there were maimings and there were reprisals that moved from one street to the next. Violence, if you like, feeding on itself. But even within that, there is a distinction worth making. Not every man on those streets was a criminal. Some were simply hard men who were accustomed to violence, shaped by their environment, working when work was available, surviving, if you like, as best they could. Others crossed further into abuse, into predation, into acts that went well beyond street fighting. There were men who were cruel, men who were racist, men who were sexually violent, and they operated within a culture that both enabled and restrained them, a code of the street that governed behavior even as it encouraged brutality. So that then had me asking, what produces that kind of violence? Because it doesn't emerge in isolation. These men are living in a world that is physically and socially constrained, poorly built houses in sanitary conditions, no parks, no open spaces, no structured recreation. The street isn't just where they spend their time, it's where they build their identity. It's their playground, their meeting place, their arena. And in a very real sense, it's the only thing that they can actually claim to own. Ownership, I think, in that context, it's not legal, it's enforced. A street belongs to those who can hold it, and is actually held by being harder than the gang that live in the next street. That's the logic. It's simple, it's brutal, it's self-perpetuating, and it's from that logic that the gangs take shape. But by the end of the 19th century, there is an attempt to break that cycle. In 1899, a new figure arrives in Birmingham policing, a man by the name of Charles Horton Rafter, brought in from Belfast with a reputation for fairness rather than sectarian bias. Unlike the fictional figures we see in the television show, he's actually not driven by ideology, but by a practical understanding of disorder, which is actually shaped by his time in the Irish constabulary. And he comes with a clear remit, which is to deal with the gangs and to restore control to the streets. What he finds is a force that is simply not equipped for the task. The Birmingham police are undermanned, overstretched, and often outmatched in physical confrontations. So Rafter moves quickly. Recruitment is accelerated, standards are set, young, fit men are brought in with a minimum height requirement that ensures a physical presence on the streets. Training is not theoretical, it's direct and demanding. Men like Sergeant Doherty drill them hard, preparing them for confrontation rather than avoidance, because confrontation, it's inevitable. The Peaky Blinders themselves are not large men on the whole, often around 5'4", 5'2", but they're tough, they're wiry, they're accustomed to fighting. So to counter them, the police don't stand back, they engage. The process is stripped down to essentials. And when you're hiring one of these young men, there were 3 questions that they asked. Can you read? Can you write? And can you fight? Because that's what it comes down to. And what follows, by all accounts, is not a gradual restoration of order, but a series of very hard-fought street battles. Memoirs from retired policemen describe it in exactly those terms, a fight for the streets with no quarter given. There are serious incidents. Gang members are killed by rivals. Policemen are killed in the line of duty. Others are permanently injured. And it's not neat, it's not controlled, and it doesn't end overnight, but it's effective. By 1905, something has shifted. The Birmingham press begin to speak of the Peaky Blinders as if they belong to the past. And by the following decade, they are increasingly referred to in those terms as something that has been dealt with, or at least diminished to the point where they no longer dominate the streets in the same way. By 1915, in the middle of the First World War, the question actually appears in print for the first time. What's happened to the Peaky Blinders? And it's a telling question because by then, they are largely gone from view. Which leaves, of course, one final question, right? Where did they go? The answer in the end is far less mysterious than it appears. They go where the work is or where the war takes them. You know, by the time the First World War begins, many of these men, overwhelmingly laborers, and not particularly skilled, not especially educated, but physically capable, find themselves drawn into the munition factories, into places like the Birmingham Small Arms Company, where the demand for production is constant and the wages for once are good. Others go to the Western Front, into the machinery of war itself, and there the violence they had known on the streets is replaced by something far larger, far more impersonal, and of course far more deadly. And that, more than anything, is what breaks up the continuity of the Peaky Blinders. Because by the time the war ends, the men who might once have been called Peaky Blinders are no longer there in the same way. Some have been killed, some are maimed, some altered by what they have seen and done, and others are simply older, no longer young men fighting for territory in the same instinctive way. The generation that sustained the culture has been thinned out, dispersed, or transformed. So by the 1920s, the Peaky Blinders as a phenomena have largely disappeared from Birmingham. Not because they were reformed in any normal sense, but because the conditions that sustained them have shifted, and the men themselves are no longer in a position to maintain that same pattern of street-based violence. That's not to say that the streets are suddenly peaceful. There are still smaller gangs, still localized violence, but the widespread endemic backstreet gang culture that has dominated from the late 1860s has receded. The police, by the years just before the war, have largely reasserted control over the streets of Birmingham. But something else has been set in motion. Because of all that violence, all of that organization, all of that instinct for control, it doesn't simply vanish. It usually evolves into something more dirty, more deadly. And what begins to emerge is something more structured, more deliberate, and in many ways more dangerous: organized crime. Out of the remnants of those earlier gangs comes what became known as the Birmingham Gang, a group that moves away from the back streets and into a different arena altogether: the race courses. And here, for once, the popular image is not entirely wrong. There is money in horse racing, a great deal of money, particularly where races can be influenced, manipulated, and of course fixed. The Birmingham Gang recognize this quickly, and they begin to travel, not just within the city, but across the Midlands and into the north, moving from racecourse to racecourse, imposing themselves and taking control. Their reputation precedes them. They are violent enough and they're organized enough that local gangs in places like Sheffield and Leeds and across Yorkshire actually find it easier to pay tribute to them than to resist. The Birmingham Gang assert control, not just through force, but through the expectation of force, the knowledge that if you do resist, you will be met decisively. And of course, around that control grows an ecosystem. Pickpocketing becomes lucrative in the crowds, but more importantly, the gangs begin to tax everything. Bookmakers, often very well off, are intimidated into paying for the right to operate. To stand in a particular place, well, there's a charge. To write the name of a horse on a board, well, there's a charge for the chalk that's used. To wipe it clean, a charge for the sponge. Every small action becomes an opportunity for extraction. And behind it all is the threat of absolute violence if payment is refused. Policing at the racecourses is minimal, and where it exists, it's often very ineffective. Some officers are simply outnumbered, others just unwilling to confront men whose reputation is built on confrontation itself. And by the early 20th century, as the street gangs are being suppressed in Birmingham, a number of their most capable members have already shifted into this new world. And it's here that they begin to be drawn together, not as a loose collection of local gangs, but as something closer to a coordinated force. And at the center of this is a man called Billy Kimber. Kimber isn't a romantic figure. He's a large, physically imposing man from Summer Lane, Birmingham, a capable fighter, but more importantly, a man who understands how to organize others. They're drawn to him by this dark magnetism. He doesn't eliminate the existing gang structures. Each group still retains its own leader, its own identity, but he brings them into alignment in a broader kind of coalition that can operate beyond a single street or a single district. There's a ruthlessness to him that extends beyond the racecourses. So before the war, he actually abandons his wife, Maud, and this is just to give you an example, leaving her to fall into poverty and to eventually die and be buried in a pauper's grave. And it's a detail that sits very uncomfortably alongside his later reputation. But what it tells you is something about the man, about the choices he makes, and the values that he doesn't hold on to. He also understands the importance of alliances. In London, he connects with George Sage of the Camden Town Gang, who's based in the north of the city, and more quietly with George MacDonald from the Elephant Boys in the south. These links extend his reach, allowing the Birmingham Gang to operate beyond their traditional territory. During the war, racing actually declines. It's seen as unpatriotic and activity slows. But once the war ends, the Birmingham Gang moves quickly to reassert itself. Control over the racehorses in the Midlands and the North is re-established. And then attention turns southwards. By 1920, through a combination of force, reputation, and alliance, they've extended their influence into London itself, linking up with their counterparts and consolidating their position in what has become a far more organised and far more lucrative form of criminal activity. The streets haven't disappeared. The streets have simply been replaced by something much bigger. But there's another layer to this. And it's an uncomfortable one because it speaks not just to violence, but to prejudice. The Birmingham Gang are not simply extorting. They're very selective in how they do it. Jewish bookmakers in particular are targeted for heavier demands. They're singled out. They're pressed harder. They're forced to pay more. And it adds a sharper edge to what's already a brutal system. And it feeds directly into what will become one of the first true gangland wars in modern Britain. One of these figures caught up in all of this is a guy by the name of Alfie Solomon, a name that later will be familiar through fiction and the TV series, but whose real-life counterpart was very different. He's not an East End caricature. He's not the stylized figure that we see on screen, but he's a man from Covent Garden operating as a bookmaker and doing so cautiously by using another name, Sidney Lewis. And he does that to avoid attention. On a particular day at the races, he actually finds himself confronted by a man named Tommy Armstrong, one of the more violent Birmingham Gang members, and by all accounts, a man of considerable violence. Armstrong actually wants to place a bet of £40, a huge amount of money on a horse, but he actually doesn't have the money. And he expects the bet to be taken on trust, with payment to follow if he loses. And it is, in effect, a demand rather than a request. Well, Solomon's refuses, and of course the horse wins. Armstrong returns not to settle a loss, but to collect winnings from a bet that never properly existed. There's an argument, it's brief, it's tense, and then it turns. In a moment, Armstrong removes his binoculars and brings them down hard across Solomon's face. He goes to the ground, badly injured, But the attack doesn't stop there. Armstrong continues the beating and then, if to underline the point, turns his attention to another Jewish bookmaker standing very nearby and assaults him with such severity that the man will die weeks later from his injuries. Armstrong is arrested. He's charged with manslaughter, but when the case comes forward, there are no witnesses willing to speak. No one steps forward, no one wants to risk it, and so he walks free. This is the spark. What follows is not an isolated act of violence, but a shift in the balance. For Solomons, this is the moment where the line is crossed. Up to this point, he's not a gangster. He's a bookmaker, a man who has served in the First World War, who has done his part for Britain. But the attack forces a change, and survival now requires realignment. So he turns to a guy by the name of Edward Emanuel, who's a significant Jewish figure in the East End. Operating out of Whitechapel and Spitalfields, he's a man who's already involved in illegal gambling operations, in the running of so-called spielers, and he's connected to established bookmakers such as Walter Beresford. Emanuel understands immediately what Solomons represents. It's not just an attack, but an opportunity. So on his own, however, he doesn't have the strength to challenge the Birmingham Gang and their London allies. So he looks outwards, and he finds it in an emerging figure by the name of Darby Sabini, an Anglo-Italian gangster operating out of Clerkenwell and King's Cross, with a mixed gang of Italians and English fighters, and they're organized and they're disciplined and they're ready to expand. So what forms is a Jewish-Italian alliance. It's a loose one, but it becomes something more deliberate. And in the spring and early summer of 1921, that alliance meets the Birmingham Gang in a series of violent confrontations that mark a complete turning point. This is no longer backstreet fighting, no longer localized disputes, but organized conflict between groups from different cities, each with structure, with leadership, and with something substantial at stake. And the racecourses around Great Britain become the battlegrounds. Violence is open, it's sustained, and widely reported, and it begins to threaten something larger, the viability of racing itself. Attendance drops, headlines multiply, and those with a vested interest in the sport begin to intervene. And interestingly, Emanuel proves to be the more astute operator. He actually goes on to establish the Bookmakers Protection Association, a structure that actually brings together those being targeted. And there's an irony with this because he's a gangster himself. But what he offers is a degree of collective security. More importantly, he secures support from the Jockey Club, which is increasingly concerned about the damage being done to the sport, and also from the Metropolitan Police, who see this arrangement as a way to restore order without their direct, constant confrontation. And then comes the crucial move. Sabini's men are brought in not as aggressors, but as official stewards, given a form of legitimacy, a sanctioned role in maintaining order on the racecourses. And it's actually a shift that changes the dynamic entirely. The Birmingham Gang, so effective in open intimidation, now find themselves facing an organized opposition with institutional backing. And of course, they're eventually defeated. But what emerges from this is something completely new. The first clear example of organized gang warfare between structured groups from different cities in Britain. And it's rooted directly in the evolution of those earlier street gangs. Billy Kimber, at the center of it, is himself a product of the earlier world. And many of the men who fight under him began as Peaky Blinders. The street, once again, has evolved, but it hasn't softened. And what you're left with in the end is not the story of people they think they know, not the sharp suits, not the swagger, not the mythology that has grown up around the name. What you're left with is something far more uncomfortable. A generation of young men shaped in narrow streets and cramped houses in a world where violence was not an exception, but a language, sometimes learned early, practiced often, and rarely questioned. They didn't step outside society. They were actually formed by their own society. and in many ways, they reflected British society back. The Peaky Blinders didn't disappear because they were defeated in some final dramatic reckoning. They faded effectively because the conditions that created them shifted, because war took them, work absorbed them, time wore them down. But the instincts they carried, the organization, the appetite for control, simply moved on from the backstreets to the racecourses, from local violence to something more structured, more profitable, and in many ways, more enduring. And that's a point worth holding on to. Because when we look back at the Peaky Blinders, it's very easy to admire the image and forget the reality. Easy to see style where there was desperation, to see charisma where there was cruelty. But strip all of that away, and what remains is stark. There was extreme poverty, there was extreme violence, and young men shaped by both, becoming something their city would later pretend not to recognize. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.